All battles are important, but not all important battles are as crucial or decisive as the one played out at a field 6 miles north of the town of Hastings in 1066. The place and the date are both deeply ingrained into the history of Britain because it was a day when everything changed. Let's travel back to the 11th century to meet two commanders, two evenly matched armies, and one battle. One of the most, if not the most crucial battle of the Middle Ages. Welcome to Medieval Madness. This Sceptred Isle. The first invasion of Britain that we have any real evidence for was in 700 BC, when the tall, fair-haired Celts arrived and conquered the short, dark-haired people known as the Iberians. It was one of their many Celtic tribes, the Brythons, that gave the island its name. Then came the Romans, first in 55 BC and then in AD 43, when Claudius invaded proper and, except for Scotland, conquered the entire island. The Romans ruled for over 400 years, protecting the Britons from wilder raiders such as the Picts, the Scots, and the northern German pirates known as the Saxons. But early in the 5th century, the Romans began to withdraw as the empire fell, and so began the Middle Ages. In the 7th century, the Saxons from Germany, the Jutes from Jutland, and the Angles from somewhere in between arrived. Then, in the late 8th century, along came the Vikings with their raiding, pillaging, and settling. And it was also the Vikings that raided and then settled in West Francia, now modern-day France. Yes, the Normans, who lived in the north of France, were essentially Vikings, Northmen mainly from Denmark, but also from Norway and Sweden, who raided and then settled there. Rollo, the first ruler of Normandy, swore allegiance to King Charles III in 911. Once expanded to become the Duchy of Normandy, the dynasty had a major influence on the politics, culture, and military control of medieval Europe. By the year 1066, England, held by the Anglo-Saxons, was one of the wealthiest countries in Europe. Its throne, one of the most coveted. In January of that year, across the little villages of England where the majority of the people lived, for the most part, life was good. Yet, it was a tough life, and everyone had to work hard to survive. But there were always rewards for the labour, because in times of peace, there was always plenty of food and drink, and taxes were low. England had suffered from cold, wet weather for a long time, but in 1066, and for the next couple of hundred years, even that was improving, and the people would enjoy mild winters and warm summers, where most importantly, crops would thrive. In those villages where everybody knew everyone else, as well as every animal, even every tree, strangers were seldom ever seen. King Edward had been on the throne for 24 years, tales of the Scandinavian Vikings were a thing of the past, and so the English were content. Like father, like son. Edward the Confessor was the 7th son of Ethelred II, known as the Unready, and Emma of Normandy. Born sometime between 1003 and 05, Edward succeeded to the throne of England in 1042 after the death of King Harthacnut. Edward had lived in exile for 25 years, mainly in Normandy, with his brother Alfred before his return to England. His wife Edith, who he married in 1045, was the daughter of Godwin of Wessex, the most powerful earl in England. On January the 4th, Edward spent most of the day lying unconscious in a royal palace near the River Thames in London. The illness had started 2 months earlier, referred to at the time as a malady of the brain. It was likely a series of minor strokes. As a dying king, Edward had a serious problem. He had no heir. In the 1120s, William of Malmesbury wrote the Chronicles of the Kings of England, and even he admitted that he couldn't, quote, decide what precisely was the truth when it came to the question of Edward the Confessor's succession. The Godwinson clan had dominated English politics ever since Godwin had been made Earl of Wessex by Canute the Great 46 years earlier. On the death of Godwin, his father, Harold had become overlord to the southernmost third of England, and along with his brothers, the House of Godwin looked set to become a powerful royal dynasty. According to The Life of King Edward, who rests at Westminster, which was written in Latin for Queen Edith by an anonymous scribe, possibly a Flemish servant in 1067, Harold was tall and a good earl. Quote, "Well practiced in endless fatigues, and doing without sleep and food, and endowed with mildness of temper, and a more ready understanding. Although," quote, "disturbers of the peace, thieves, and robbers needed to beware, as this champion of the law threatened with the terrible face of a lion." It was on the 5th of January 1066, on his deathbed in the presence of the Queen and the Archbishop of Canterbury, that Edward turned to the 43-year-old Harold, the senior Earl of England, and said, quote, "I commend all the kingdom to your protection." Then, after falling back into a coma, he died. The man who would be king. Meanwhile, across the Channel in Normandy, Duke Robert I, known as the Magnificent, had died in 1035 whilst on a pilgrimage. His illegitimate son, the 8-year-old William, being his only male heir, inherited his title as Duke of Normandy, as well as being known as William the Bastard all over France. Robert had the French king Henry I recognize his son and made sure that the most important men in Normandy swore their allegiance to William before he left for Jerusalem. William's youth and status caused many problems as Norman nobles fought each other to control the child duke. However, in 1047, William was able to crush a rebellion and establish his power over the duchy. William was a distant relation to King Edward, as he was the grandson of Edward's maternal uncle, Richard II of Normandy. In the Deeds of the English Kings, which he completed in 1125, the historian William of Malmesbury described William as, quote, "of just stature, extraordinary corpulence, fierce countenance, his forehead bare of hair, of such great strength of arm, that no one was able to draw his bow, which himself could bend when his horse was at full gallop. And he was also of excellent health." Yet another William, this time a monk of Jumièges, agreed in his Deeds of the Dukes of Normandy, written about 1070, that William was, quote, "great in body, strong, and tall in stature." William's marriage to Matilda of Flanders in the 1050s helped his cause and gave him powerful allies in the neighbouring county of Flanders. By 1066, now in full control of his lands and his nobles, William ruled Normandy with an iron fist and was ready to expand his horizons. As the news reached him of Edward's death, William was ready to become King of England. After all, it was Edward himself who had promised the throne to him over 15 years ago, back in 1051. And it is true that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle does mention a visit to England from William in that year, but for what reason, we do not know. So now, Edward the Confessor lies dead, and two powerful and ambitious men believed that they both had a claim to the throne. When Harold had himself crowned just a day after the old king's death, a showdown was inevitable, and a furious William made the decision to invade. By February, William had called together his nobles to gain support for his invasion of England, but to his surprise, they were more than a little hesitant about going to war because of the number of troops that Harold could bring into the fight. William's next move was to get the Catholic Church on side. A papal blessing was sure to bring men flocking to the cause, so he sent the Archdeacon Gilbert of Lisieux to Rome to petition Pope Alexander II, who not only agreed that William's cause was a holy endeavour, but he also gave William a papal banner to carry into battle. Now men flocked to fight by his side, including the nobles, especially when William promised many of them estates in England as a reward for their loyalty. Mercenaries came from as far away as Italy for a chance to grow rich with treasure both here on earth and in heaven. In the end, almost 3/4 of his army was made up from foreign mercenaries. Now all William needed was a fleet to carry his army to England. The narrowest part of the Channel crossing from France to England is opposite the English port of Dover. However, this part of the coast belonged to the Count of Flanders. So William chose the port of Dives on the coast of Normandy to the northwest of Paris, and over the next 2 months he began to build ships and gather supplies and troops. By the summer, William had overseen the building of almost 700 boats, ready to carry his army across the Channel. On the night of the Tuesday following Easter, a colossal light appeared in the sky, followed by a fiery trail. People stared up in fear as it passed overhead. The monks called it a hairy star or a comet, and it was seen all over England that night and for a week after. Today we know it was Halley's Comet, but in 1066 for the English medievals it was seen as a portent of doom, a sign of heaven's fire and wrath upon the earth. Defense of the realm. In England, Harold was being sent information from his spies on the progress of the Norman war machine. He too began gathering a force in defense of his island and his crown. He believed that the Isle of Wight just off the southern coast would be the most likely place where William and his fleet would land, so he stationed himself and his troops there whilst he had scouts and ships positioned at strategic points along the coast to warn of any enemy sightings. Harold's main army was made up of 3 types of soldier. The heart of it consisted of his housecarls, a group of full-time professional hand-picked men. They were few in number, perhaps only around 4,000, but what they lacked in size they made up for in skill. Supporting the housecarls was a part-time body of troops known as the Fjord. These men were a militia and included the minor nobles known as thanes. Finally came every able-bodied man that could be called upon to fight. Badly organized and armed, they were really there to make up the numbers. It was 12,000 men from the housecarls and the Fjord that were stationed along the coast waiting to repel the invasion. And they waited week after week, month after month. It wasn't that William didn't want to sail, he was ready for the fight, but the winds were against him, and without a southerly wind, the boats now assembled at the mouth of the River Dives simply couldn't sail. Harold was not only running out of patience, but he was also running out of supplies, as feeding a large army was an expensive business. The harvest was due in, and many of the men were itching to get back to their homes. So Harold made the fateful decision to dismantle the army and go home to London. Seek and destroy. In August, King Harald Hardrada of Norway had completed his plans to invade. After leaving home with his fleet, he gathered more men and ships in the friendly islands of the Shetlands and Orkneys, before going to Scotland to meet Harold Godwinson's brother Tostig, who, annoyed at being exiled by his brother, had brought even more ships. Once they reached Northumbria on the east coast of England, the Vikings rampaged across Yorkshire and made their way by boat up the River Ouse. Their goal was to reach the city of York. Once he heard the news, Harold had no choice but to meet the danger head-on. He quickly reassembled his army and with swift determination began the long march north with his housecarls, gathering men of the Fjord as they went. By the time they had reached the Vikings at Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September, the Saxon army had grown to thousands and accomplished their march of over 180 miles in an astounding 5 days. The Norsemen were taken by surprise. They hadn't expected Harold to arrive with his army so quickly, and were split into 2 groups along a strip of land by the River Derwent, the stronger half camped next to the riverbank and the weaker beside a marsh. The Vikings were so unprepared that they weren't even wearing any chainmail armor, having taken it off and left it on the ships before lazing in the sun on the west side of the river. The Saxons moved in, trapping these Vikings in a bottleneck, as there was nowhere for them to go except across a narrow wooden bridge that joined the 2 sides of the river. Every Norseman on the west bank who couldn't get across the bridge was slaughtered. In his chronicle, The History of the English, first published around 1129, the historian Henry of Huntingdon writes a story describing how one of the Norsemen stood firm at the entrance to the bridge. Quote, "Here a single Norwegian, whose name ought to have been preserved, took post on a bridge, and hewing down more than 40 of the English with a battle axe, his country's weapon, stayed the advance of the whole English army. At last someone came under the bridge in a boat, and thrust a spear into him through the chinks of the flooring." With the Viking warrior now dead, the Saxons poured across the bridge where the Norsemen had formed a shield wall to face the attack. The Saxons also locked shields and charged. The battle raged on for hours. Whoever could fracture the wall would win, but the Vikings were at a disadvantage without their armor, and eventually a small opening in their wall became bigger and bigger. Harold's men streamed through, surrounding the Norwegians. Hardrada was killed with an arrow to the throat, and his army fell apart. It was later said that so many died in so small an area that bleached bones still lay about 50 years after the battle. For now, Harold was still king. But after his return to York in triumph, he heard the news. William, Duke of Normandy, has landed on the south coast. The Promised Land. Just around the time that Harold was in the north of England battling the Norsemen, the wind was finally changing direction on the French coast, and William's huge invasion fleet was able to set sail. It was sunset as the Norman ships left the harbour to the strident noise of cymbals and trumpets. It had been a mad scramble to load the ships after weeks of waiting. William of Poitiers, who wrote the Gesta Guilelmi, the narrative of the Battle of Hastings, which was finished before 1077, said, quote, "Their haste was so great that some feared being left behind." Almost 700 ships carried 2,000 horses and 7,000 men. Restless warriors who had been waiting impatiently for weeks to take on the English. It was about 9 o'clock on the morning of the 28th of September when the ships landed at Pevensey Bay in East Sussex, around 10 miles west of Hastings. First to disembark were the archers, ready for the confrontation. But there was nobody there. William and his men couldn't believe their luck. No one could have ever predicted that Harold and his army would be hundreds of miles away, still celebrating their victory in the north. Now William had no other choice but to get Harold to come to him quickly. He was in a hostile country and couldn't risk going further inland to meet his enemy, so he began to systematically destroy the nearby villages, slaughtering everything in his path. He couldn't afford to let Harold gather more troops by waiting. Harold was quickly making his way south in the hope that he could take the Normans by surprise, but his army was badly depleted. The housecarls had suffered great losses at Stamford. It took the 4,000-strong Saxon army just 5 days to make the 250-mile journey, and by the time they reached Colbeck Hill on the afternoon of Friday the 12th of October, their numbers had swelled by another 3,000 men. It is an enduring myth that the Battle of Hastings took place at Hastings. It did in fact take place at a relatively unpopulated area about 6 miles inland near Colbeck Hill. The place later became known as Battle for obvious reasons, and once an abbey was built there, a town grew up around it. It was at Battle that Harold and his men camped for the night. Start as you mean to go on. There are several contemporary accounts of the battle itself, most of them contradictory. What is known for definite is that the fighting began at 9 AM on the morning of Saturday the 14th of October, 1066, when William and his army arrived from Hastings and went on until dark, which on that day would have been between 5 and 6 PM. Harold lined up his men at the top of a steep slope, the line stretched for about half a mile, the men's outer edges protected by woods. The Saxon army consisted entirely of infantrymen who fought together as one, using the shield wall to wear down their enemies. The men stood soldier to soldier, tightly packed, their shields held out in front, not interlocking but slightly overlapping so that they had room to swing their axes. The painted shields carried by the housecarls reinforced with metal, the ones used by the peasants probably just adapted from doors or window shutters. All the men were under strict orders from their king not to even let so much as a chink of light show between those shields. Behind the wall, more men stood ready, less well armoured, but in lines of 6 to 10 men deep. Beneath his 2 banners, Harold II, King of England, sat at the top of the ridge astride a black horse surveying the scene. For the Normans, the mounted knights were central to their battle plan. Their stallions were specially bred for their strength and skill, and trained to attack their enemies with headbutts, kicks, and bites. The knights were equipped with heavy broadswords, spears and lances, and wore chainmail and helmets like the English housecarls, and carried long kite-shaped shields, although the horses were unprotected. William's cavalry was a formidable fighting force and the pride of his army. On foot were the archers with their short bows, the longbow with their much greater range still being a weapon of the future. The Norman foot soldiers carried short swords or axes and wore steel helmets and shirts made from either thick leather or chainmail. The Normans stood at a disadvantage at the bottom of the hill. William, the Duke of Normandy, on horseback carried a mace and a spike-topped wooden staff and sat beneath the papal banner to remind everyone there that they were on a mission from God. William had arranged his men into 3 groups, the Bretons to the left, led by Alan the Red, the French and men from Flanders to the right, commanded by William Fitzosbern, and Count Eustace II of Boulogne. In the centre, under his direct command, were the Normans. At the front, William placed the archers in the hope that they could break down the men in the shield wall ready for the 2,000 mounted knights to smash through. Roars went up from either side, and the Saxons who were holding their ground began to beat their shields. Someone had to make the first move, so William ordered his men to begin the march uphill towards the enemy. Legend has it that a Norman minstrel or juggler by the name of Taillefer went forward alone. Having asked William for permission to do so, he rode up the hill, singing and throwing his sword into the air and catching it. According to Huntington, the Saxons were lost in amazement at his, quote, gambols. Having reached the front line, Taillefer was said to have thrown himself at the Englishmen and was able to kill 2, including a standard bearer, before he was struck down. Behind the minstrel came the archers, but they were shooting uphill and their arrows made little impact, either flying over the heads of the Saxons or becoming embedded in their shields. As the Normans got closer, Poitiers writes, quote, "The English killed and maimed many with their missiles. They threw javelins and missiles of various kinds, murderous axes, and stones tied to sticks." The knights went forward, but the Saxons thrust their spears and swords through the wall, so that, quote, "the loud shouting was drowned by the clash of weapons and the groans of the dying." Poitiers goes on to say that, quote, "For a time both sides fought with all their might. The English were greatly helped by the advantage of the higher ground, which they held in serried ranks without sallying forward, and also by their great numbers and densely packed mass, and moreover by their weapons of war, which easily penetrated shields and other protections. So they strongly held or drove back those who dared to attack them with drawn swords. They even wounded those who flung javelins at them from a distance." End quote. It was then that the Normans showed the first signs of weakness, and in a move that would actually prove to be the undoing of the English rather than the French, quote, "Terrified by this ferocity, both the foot soldiers and the Breton knights and other auxiliaries on the left wing turned tail, and almost all of the Duke's battle line gave way." After about an hour of fighting, panicked the Normans both on horseback and on foot fled back downhill in the direction that they had come. Many of the knights struggled with the horses as they became bogged down in the marshy land at the bottom of the valley. Seeing the enemy running away from the fight proved to be too much of a temptation for the Saxons. Those on the right wing of the wall broke ranks and ran down the hill after the Bretons. Harold, who was fighting on the front line shoulder to shoulder with his men, must have looked on in horror as he saw his men deserting the shield wall. The Saxons, having run down to the marshy area at the bottom of the hill, were now exposed behind enemy lines. Harold had a choice: either charge down the hill and join the others in the attack, or stay on the ridge and defend. He chose to stay put and defend his position. Even the Frenchman Poitiers admits that, quote, "The English fought confidently with all their might, striving particularly to prevent a gap being opened by their attackers." He goes on to say that the Saxons were, quote, "so tightly packed together that there was hardly room for the slain to fall." Now, it's possible that Harold's decision to stand fast was pivotal to the outcome of the battle. Perhaps if Harold had charged down from the ridge while the Norman army was in disarray, things may have turned out differently. It's likely that he believed that if the Saxons moved from their strong defensive position, it would invite disaster. William, however, chose to go on the attack, and taking some of his knights with him, he galloped over to the marshy area and attacked the vulnerable Saxons. According to Poitiers, they were soon surrounded and slaughtered and, quote, destroyed in a moment so that not a single one survived. After that, it is not known whether William used pretending to run away as a deliberate strategy to lure the Saxons out of the shield wall. Poitiers wrote that the Normans deliberately feigned flight because they, quote, saw that they could not conquer such a solidly massed enemy force without heavy loss. And William had seen what happened when the group of Bretons had run away. It had exposed a gap in the wall, and the pursuing Saxons had ended up at the mercy of his knights. For the Normans, it was attack and retreat, as the English army chasing after them and exposed away from the protective wall were systematically cut down as the Normans wheeled their horses around, quote, encircled them and slaughtered them to the last man. For whom the bell tolls. Time was ticking on. Most medieval battles were over quite quickly, but this one was becoming one of the longest and closest fought, and still the shield wall remained. As the daylight was coming to a close, Harold knew that if his men could just keep it together until nightfall, reinforcements were likely to arrive and they could start the following day's fight with many more fresh troops. The only problem was the Saxons' casualties were beginning to get out of hand. The relentless Norman onslaught had caused mass fatalities on the front line, which was now made up of many less experienced men. William knew that his strategy was slowly grinding down the enemy, but he was also aware of the approaching night. So with only an hour of daylight left, he made the decision to bring his entire army together into one solid mass. Behind them, he placed his archers, ordering them to shoot not at the men on the front line, but rather up into the air, so that the arrows would fall down on top of the Saxons standing behind the shield wall. It was then, according to Huntingdon, that, quote, a shower of arrows fell around King Harold, and he himself was pierced in the eye. It was one of the most famous moments in British history. As the last Anglo-Saxon king of England lay dying, chaos ensued among the Saxons. The Normans charged, and the shield wall was finally broken. A group of French knights made straight for the body of the slain king and hacked off first one leg, then the other, and finally his head. Harold's loyal housecarls stayed faithful to the end and tried to protect Harold's body. His brothers Earl Leofric and Earl Gurth were found nearby. On hearing the news of their king's death, Saxon morale was broken, and those who were not chased down and slaughtered by the Normans slipped away quietly into the forest as night fell. Thus, proclaimed Henry of Huntingdon, the hand of the Lord brought to pass the change which a remarkable comet had foreshadowed in the beginning of the same year. Thousands of men had died. According to the Carmen Widonis, the earliest history of the Norman invasion, probably written by Guy, Bishop of Amiens, within months of the battle. The following morning, the Normans buried their dead, but left the English, quote, to be eaten by worms and wolves, by birds and dogs. Harold's body couldn't be found, as he had been hacked to pieces. However, accounts of his death are contradictory. In William of Poitiers' account, only his death is mentioned without any details of how it occurred. The Bayeux Tapestry, a 70-meter embroidered cloth that depicts the events of the Norman Conquest, isn't much help either, as it shows two figures beneath the declaration, "Here King Harold has been killed," one with an arrow sticking out of his eye, and the other falling to the ground whilst being hit by a sword. It's not clear which figure the statement applies to, and it may even apply to both. War of Change. The 38-year-old William the Conqueror was crowned King of England on Christmas Day of 1066 at Westminster Abbey in London. His conquest caused one of the biggest upheavals in the political and cultural landscape of Britain since the Roman invasion. For centuries to come, government, law, religion, and even architecture were affected by the Norman conquest. Overnight, Englishmen found themselves ruled over by a new group of men who couldn't even speak their language. From the outset, the English found it hard to accept the new regime, and rebellion was inevitable. William found that he had to quell revolts in almost every part of his new kingdom. The result was wholesale destruction, as the Normans, numbering around 10,000, burned villages and crops as they tried to impose their will on 500,000 Britons. Despite the events at Hastings highlighting the importance of cavalry in battle, mass shield walls continued to be used up until the end of the 12th century, especially in places unsuitable for mounted combat. Edward the Confessor's widow and Harold's sister Edith lost all 4 of her remaining brothers at the battles of Stamford Bridge and Hastings. She was the only senior member of the Godwin family to survive the Norman conquest and remain in England as Harold's sons fled to Ireland. According to the medieval historian Stephen Baxter, Edward the Confessor's, quote, handling of the succession issue was dangerously indecisive and contributed to one of the greatest catastrophes that the English had ever succumbed. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Please do leave a like and a comment on the video if you enjoyed it, so we know whether to make more long format videos like this. And if you want to stay up to date with all the videos we release, then be sure to subscribe to the channel too and click the bell icon to be notified whenever we put out a new video. So until next time, hope everyone's doing well. Cheers!